Wake up at Holiday Inn Express to a can't-miss breakfast that's free with every stay. Count on all the hot, fresh coffee you need and an incredible breakfast buffet that has something for everyone, like eggs, cinnamon rolls, and even hot, fresh pancakes with all the toppings you crave. Next time, do yourself a favor and stay at a Holiday Inn Express with a can't-miss breakfast that's free with every stay. So, when you wake up at Holiday Inn Express, you'll wake up happy. A part of IHG Hotels and Resorts.
Judy was boring.
Hello.
Then Judy discovered ChumbaCasino.com.
It's my little escape.
Now Judy's the life of the party.
Oh, baby, mama's bringing home the bacon.
Whoa, take it easy, Judy. The Chumba life is for everybody. So go to ChumbaCasino.com and play over 100 casino-style games. Join today and play for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. ChumbaCasino.com. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
Well, good morning and welcome to the Footlight Broadcast. Good morning, Sandy. Good morning, everybody else joining on YouTube, on Twitter, on Rumble, and on Facebook. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope I'll do my best to pay it off and make sure that your time is well invested today. We will unpack today the first half of Romans chapter 3. And you'll see probably if you look beyond verse 20 where we'll stop today, the reason why I'm going to leave that for next week or I think maybe the week after, depending. No, next week. I'm 2 weeks from now. I won't be doing a show. I've got a family commitment on the 18th, but next week on the 11th, I believe we'll be just fine, Lord willing. So you'll see why I'm separating these when you read ahead, because it really kind of combines with chapter 4 beyond verse 21 in chapter 3. Good morning, Sabrina. And thank you all again for your time and attention. Let's just start with a word of prayer real quick. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to share your word. Thank you that you have given lots of commentators throughout time insight, that we've been able to benefit from that and learn from the insights of others, as well as your own gift to us of the Holy Spirit that helps us understand the scriptures. So thank you, Lord, for that. Want to jump into just a real quick, some housekeeping stuff. This is, again, the Footlight Broadcast. You can find the show notes at the footlight.com website. Now, I didn't update last week's. I apologize for that. I will get it done right after the show, as well as today's. If you want to communicate something about the show, you can call the message line, 866-988-8311. That is suggestions for topics, insight into the current chapter. The next one, is coming chapter 4, as well as disagreements. You're welcome to also to email that to brian@thefootlight.com. And I covet your Facebook messages, YouTube comments, etc. So enough of the housekeeping stuff. Let's just get right into our study of Romans 3. So I'm going to read this text off to you, and then we'll unpack it. We're going to read through verse 7. If you have your Bible, you might want to follow along. I use the New King James Version, not because it's better, because I'm used to it, I guess, more. Lots of great versions of the Bible out there. So let's start chapter 3, verse 1. What advantage then has the Jew? Or what is the profit of circumcision? Much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. For what if some did not believe? Will their unbelief make the faithfulness of God without effect? Certainly not. Indeed, let God be true, but every man a liar. As it is written, that you may be justified in your words and may overcome when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unjust who inflicts wrath? I speak as a man. Certainly not. For then how will God judge the world? For if the truth of God is increased through my lie to his glory, why am I also judged as a sinner? And why not say, let us do evil that good may come, as we are slanderously reported, and some affirm that we say their condemnation is just. So that's through verse 8. And here we go. Let's just see what we have to say about that, I guess. So let's unpack it. First verse he says, what advantage then has the Jew, or what is the profit of circumcision? Now, Paul's been going through this expository idea that all men are sinners, that the Greeks are sinners, the Jews are sinners. And he says, now he's kind of indicted them last chapter. And now he says, what advantage then has the Jew? And, what is the profit of circumcision? This is, of course, a question intended to make a point here, right? And so what is this profit of circumcision thing? And, everyone knows what circumcision is, right? But this was a covenant mark that was given in the, to the Jews as a mark in their bodies to identify them as covenant keepers with God. Now, one of the questions people often had, and I used to have about this is, well, for goodness sake, how would anybody know? How would anybody know if you were circumcised or not? I mean, in our Western culture, very few people ever see your private parts, right? And so, I mean, how would this be something that anybody would know whether you were circumcised or not? Well, and back in the Bible times, you have to understand that public nudity was relatively common. Now, what I don't mean is that people were walking around the streets or around their neighborhoods naked. This was not the case, but you have to recognize that there were no tidy whities, right? back in the Bible days, there were no nice, neat stalls for using the bathroom. There were no showers or bathtubs at home. So people often cleaned themselves in the river, in the lake, or in a public bath of some kind. And a lot of people, because again, there was not a lot of wealth distributed, right? People were basically hand-to-mouth subsistence income for the most part. And most people only had, or many people only had one garment. They didn't have like, a whole closet full of stuff like we do, or a whole, chest of drawers full of different, colors and styles of underwear, depending on the weather and the day of the week, right? And I mean, I don't know about you guys, but, the old saying, maybe your mom told you, hey, make sure you got clean underwear on because you might be in an accident. Well, in that culture, you better make sure you had your one pair of underwear on because you didn't have any other pair. So when you went down to bathe, oftentimes people just stripped down to bathe and then they would actually wash their clothing sometimes at the same time, right? Or depending, they wouldn't wash their clothing because they didn't want to put wet clothing back on when they got out. So this is one of the ways that the Jews identified themselves, is by this mark in their body. Now, there were also a thing called, and I'm sorry, my Hebrew pronunciation is not great, but it's a mikvaot. And this was like a public baptismal. The Jews were very concerned about purity, about cleanliness. There was ritual washings and so on. And so these mikvaots were scattered all over Judea and Galilee, and it was a pool in which the Jews would immerse themselves for the idea of becoming ritually clean before they went to the temple. And so these were basically almost like baptistries, and this is why people didn't really argue about the concept of baptism, because it was commonly known that a ritual washing was necessary to go into the presence of God purely. And so this was the idea here of the mikvaot. And so the idea of the what is the profit of circumcision, of course, you have to know how that people are, right? And this is how. Okay, so verse 2, Paul continues on, much in every way. Much in every way is the advantage and the profit of circumcision, as he says, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. And so the Jews had been given the Old Testament, right? They'd been given the prophets. They'd been given the Psalms, the wisdom literature. And the oracles of God means that they've been given God's word. And they had preserved it. And the Jews had more information and better information than any of the Gentiles. And so this is the advantage that the Jew has that Paul begins to address in verse 1. What advantage has the Jews? Well, they should have known better, if you will. They should have been able to, from understanding the Old Testament, they should have been able to recognize the Messiah. In other words, with great knowledge comes great responsibility. And because the Jews had superior knowledge of the things of God, they had a higher level of responsibility. Let's go on. Verse 3, for what if some did not believe? Will their unbelief make the faithfulness of God without effect? What is this saying? Well, our belief in God, it doesn't add anything to him, and our unbelief doesn't take anything away from him. God is faithful regardless of what we do. But what Paul's addressing here is the idea that the Jews were supposed to be saved by the Messiah. I mean, here they are in Rome, right? He's writing to the Roman church. The Messiah has come, and obviously there were Jews who hadn't become Christians. They hadn't come to a saving knowledge of Jesus. And for this reason, there were people questioning, is God faithful? Can God be relied on? After all, he said the Messiah would save the Jews, and there are some Jews who aren't saved. So hence the question, what if some did not believe? Well, their unbelief, and the unbelief he's addressing is the unbelief of some of those who should believe because they have superior knowledge and they know better. Does their unbelief make God's faithfulness without effect? And so these are rhetorical questions, right? And rhetorical questions are questions that aren't really intended to elicit an answer. They are to make a point through the interrogative process, right? And so Paul's been asking this series of rhetorical questions, which he'll continue later on. What advantage has the Jew? What is the profit of circumcision? What if some didn't believe? Will their unfaithfulness make God, somehow unfaithful? These are Paul making a point through these questions. And then he continues on, verse 4, certainly not. Indeed, let God be true, but every man a liar, as it's written, that you may be justified in your words and may overcome when you are judged. Now, Paul's answering some of his own questions here, right? Certainly not, he says, right? Absolutely not. It doesn't matter what men say or do. It doesn't change the faithfulness of God. And Paul's referencing here, it says, as it is written. Now, one of the things we have to do or should do every time we see as it is written, we should go find out where it was written, because then we can get some context for what was written, right? So Paul's referencing here Psalm 51. And so it's verses 3 and 4. And let me read it to you. Let me share it with you what it says here. It says, for I acknowledge my transgression, and my sin is always before me. This is Paul after his adultery with Bathsheba. And he's repenting of his sin. He says, my sin is always before me. Against you and you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight, that you may be found just when you speak and blameless when you judge. In Romans, it says that you may be justified in your words and overcome when you are judged. And so what he's saying is, because I'm a sinner, God, you're faithful. Every man can be a liar. And because you're faithful, you're just when you judge me for my sin. And so he's saying here that he's just when he judges the Jews for their sin, is what Paul's communicating here. And the sin of what? Of unbelief on the part of some of them. Now, I want you to start paying attention, if you will, through the rest of this, how often in the upcoming verses, and in this one we just had said that you may be found justified when you speak, right? Justified in your words. I want you to start paying attention to how often Paul is referencing the way people speak here. The idea here is our words are really, really important. They really matter. And he says, when, let God be true and every man a liar. Well, what are you doing when you lie? You're speaking, right? Or sometimes you're not speaking, but you're communicating something. In either way, you're representing verbally or somehow otherwise something that's not true. Let's just say you're not even using words. You're using pantomime or charades, right? You're still communicating things that are understood in words. So God is talking here about maybe just when you speak, right? And so if we think about it, the power of words is kind of a big deal. In the third verse of Genesis, this is right at the opening of the Bible, God said, let there be light. And there is power in our words. What we say is of great consequence. And if we look for, kind of a reference for that idea, Jesus said back in Matthew 12:34, in the Gospel of Matthew, it says, for out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And the idea isn't that your words necessarily condemn you, but your words are a reflection of what's in your heart. And your heart is what God is making judgments about. Again, in Luke 6:45, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, his mouth speaks. And so our words are super important because they reflect what's going on in our heart. Words are extremely powerful. You probably heard that when I was a kid, it was going around, it was popular to say, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, or names will never hurt me. Well, nothing can be more untrue. I mean, I've had a broken bone, and probably you have too at some point, and my broken bone healed up just fine. But some of the verbal wounds, some of the things people have said to me that were really damaging and unkind, some of those things have stuck with me a lot longer than any physical injuries ever have, right? And so words have huge consequences. Now, there's a movement that some of you may have heard of called the Word of Faith movement, and they also have observed this power of speech in the power of God's Word. And the error that these folks make, hey, Daryl, good morning, is the idea of that words are containers of power, is the way they would communicate it. Guys like Kenneth Hagin or Kenneth Copeland, these guys have the idea that words are containers of power, and that there are laws of the universe about words that even God himself is subject to. And it's almost similar to like the Christian Science movement. Mary Baker Eddy founded Christian Science, and she believed that Jesus was just a man like you and I, or just a person like you if you're a woman, right? But that Jesus understood the principles of the universe, and that all we have to do is understand and appropriate the same thing, and we'll be like Jesus. Now, the Word of Faith movement doesn't say exactly that, but what they do say is that all you have to do is, quote, speak it into existence. In the New Age movement, they call this manifesting, the idea that you would manifest what is, say it, and then it will be manifested in your life. This is the idea of the power of words, but it's a perversion or a perverse understanding, if you will, in my view. The Word of Faith movement makes God subject to the laws of the universe that he set up, as though he couldn't change them or contravene them. And I think the very nature of God is that we often see him acting outside of the laws of the universe he set up. This is what we call miracles. And this is the point, is that God can supersede any of his rules anytime he wants. And in the Word of Faith movement, they articulate the idea that God puts power into these words, and those words need to be obeyed even by God himself. They say that you can have whatever you ask God for. You might have heard some of the Word of Faith preachers say that, after all, you're a child of the King, and if you're not living like royalty, then you're not living in your proper status. I mean, if you're not living in this royal, extravagant situation, it's simply because you aren't exercising sufficient faith in your words. This is why they call it the Word of Faith movement, right? You remember Benny Hinn, what, me drive a Honda? This is the idea here, is that you can just have whatever you ask God for. And of course, that's erroneous, right? Verse 5, but if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unjust who inflicts wrath? I speak as a man. Now, Paul's asking yet another rhetorical question here. If my sins show how God is righteous, if they show how good God is, then why should he judge me? Why should he be angry at me for sinning if my sin shows off his glory? And since God has said that all men sin, some people say, well, I'm just going to keep sinning because it'll prove that God has spoken the truth. Now, Paul ends this thing with, I speak as a man. And he's not trying to imply that he's no longer under, inspiration here, no longer speaking under apostolic authority. He's explaining that only as a man without God, would anyone dare to question God's justice. Okay, and 1 Corinthians 2:14, it says, but the natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, nor can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned. And so Paul's communicating here that the natural man, he's speaking with man's normal tendency. Hey, if you're glorified by my sin, I'm going to keep on sinning, which would be a really easy decision to make, because the truth is, most of us like sinning at some level. We like going our own way. We don't really typically enjoy being under the authority of God often. Of course, once you walk with the Lord longer, you kind of understand that you really do, and it's way better for you. Now, this here is the verse 6 he says, certainly not. Certainly not. We shouldn't go on sinning, for how will God judge the world? Now, this is the second time in just 6 verses that Paul says, certainly not. And what becomes clear as you read this is Paul is countering the arguments that he either knows or suspects some are making. Verse 7 here, 7 and 8, for if the truth of God is increased through my lie to his glory, again, through my lie, this is about speech again, through my lie to his glory, why am I also still judged as a sinner? And why not say, again, our words, right? Let us do evil that good may come. As we are slanderously reported, slander is what? Evil speaking of someone, right? Slanderously reported, as some affirm. How do you do an affirmation? By communicating in words, right? Some affirm that we say their condemnation is just. And so what Paul's kind of addressing here is it appears that at least some people were making a claim that this was the teaching of Paul and the apostles, that they went on sinning and demonstrating thereby God's goodness. And so why is God judging them is kind of the idea here. Now, let's continue on with our chapter here, verses 9 through 18. I'll just read them, then we'll unpack these a little bit. Verse 9, what then? Are we better than they? Not at all. For we've previously charged both Jews and Greeks that they are all under sin. As it is written, there's none righteous, no, not one. There's none who understands. There's none who seeks after God. They have all turned aside. They've together become unprofitable. There's none who does good. No, not one. Their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they practice deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. There's no fear of God before their eyes. Now he starts this whole section, verse 10, as it is written. So again, when we see as it is written, we're going to have to figure out where it was written. So we're going to get into that here in a minute. But verse 9, what then? Are we better than they? Not at all, for we have previously charged both Jews and Greeks that they are all under sin. Now, who is the we? What then? Are we better than they? Who is the we Paul's referencing? Well, he's referencing the Jewish people, right? The Israelites, of whom he is a we. And the they are the Gentiles, right? And then he immediately clears it up at the end of verse 9 by saying both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. So let me read it again. What then? Are we, the Jews, better than they? Not at all, the Gentiles, right? For we, the Jews, have previously charged both Jews and Greeks, chapter 1, chapter 2, that they are all under sin. And so this is the traditional teaching, right? That chapter 1 is about the Greeks being under sin. Chapter 2 is about the fact that the Jews are under sin, and Greeks means Gentiles, right? And Paul's basically clarifying, hey, guess what? It's the same. For Jews and Gentiles, you're all under sin. So verse 10, we're going to jump into here, and this is the as it is written. So we'll start breaking this down. There is none righteous, no, not one. There's none who understands. Verse 11, there's none who seeks after God. They've all turned aside. They've together become unprofitable. There's none who does good. No, not one. Now, the traditional Calvinist teaching on this, and I did a series on Calvinism that you can go back and reference, but the traditional Calvinist teaching or the Reformed theological teaching is that this is the indictment of all mankind. There's no one righteous, not one. This is total depravity. Man doesn't have a chance. He can't even consider seeking and loving God, is what is taught from this. Well, let's just look at what this is. This is a direct quote from Psalm 53. Paul's quoting Psalm 53, verses 1 through 3 is where we find this. And let me read it to you. And again, Psalm 53. The fool has said in his heart, there's no God. They are corrupt and have done abominable iniquity. That our part that Paul quotes. There's none who does good. God looks down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seeks God. Every one of them has turned aside or gone their own way. They have together become corrupt. There's none who does good. No, not one. So in the context here, is this about everybody? Let's read the start of it again. The fool has said in his heart, there's no God. Who is this about? This is about people who say there's no God. In other words, it's about atheists. And this is not, in my view, as is so often taught, a verse that claims total depravity for all mankind, because Paul introduces it saying, the fool says in his heart. He's talking about atheists. Now, in my day job, for the last number of years, the industry I've been in, there are a lot of, here in the Seattle area, there are an awful lot of Middle Eastern people who are Muslims in this business. And a number of them over the years have become close friends of mine. And a number of them I know will be listening to this podcast, because I know some of them are listening to it and talk to me about it. Now, these are not people who don't believe in God. These are not atheists. Some of these people are, in my experience, good people and kind people. And the reason they're kind, the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord, right? And they fear God. They're monotheists who believe that God exists. This thing here, the fool says in his heart, there's no God, doesn't apply to them. Now, I'm not trying to say that these guys are going to heaven, that they're saved or anything like that. What I am saying is that this idea of total depravity is not true. It's just not. And further, this section of Psalms, and most of the book of Psalms, is poetry, right? And poetry, as we know, often uses hyperbole. And you've probably heard this. I've often heard Christians say things like, well, the problem with churches today, or Christians, fill in the blank, Christians don't do, there's these generalizations, right? This is hyperbole. Now, the person who's speaking when they say the problem with churches or the problem with Christians or Christians, fill in the blank, whatever it is, they're complaining about the general state of things. But they're probably not complaining about their own church. They're probably not complaining about their own Christian walk. And this is no different with David here. David wasn't a man who said, there's no God, okay? And he knew others who didn't say there was no God either. He also wasn't making a claim that there wasn't anybody who ever did any good, because David himself knew that he had done some good, and he knew other people who had done some good. This is David crying out and complaining about the state of things. It is not an absolute statement that no one ever seeks God. And this is why we have to always look back to the as it is written and where was it written. Verse 13, their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues, they have practiced deceit. Well, again, their tongues, they've practiced deceit. And what's coming out of their throat? Their words, what they have to say. Now, this thing about an open tomb, an open tomb for the Jew, an open tomb, remember Jesus said to the Pharisees, he said, that your whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones. And the problem with a tomb was most of the tombs, or many of the tombs, were in caves. Now, caves were very utilitarian in the Bible times, right? Because structures were difficult to build and expensive. And, if you think about it, there were no porta potties. There were no public restrooms. And so caves often served as a public restroom. They also often served as a haven for animals, but they also often served as a place to put dead men's bones, right? In a cave. And so the idea here is that people were coming to Jerusalem for the temple celebrations or the temple rituals, right? And they would come into Jerusalem, and sometimes people had to relieve themselves, right? And even we see King Saul going into a cave to relieve himself. And the idea is you'd come into Jerusalem, and if you had to use the restroom, you're not going to do that out in front of everybody. So you duck into a cave and you find dead men's bones in there because you think it's a restroom and it's a tomb, and now you're ritually unclean. The fear of coming in contact with a dead body was a real thing. And if you had made the journey to Jerusalem and you come into contact with a dead man's bones, you're now ritually unclean for 7 days. You can't even go to the temple, do what you came to do. And if there was a holiday that was a specific date and you were unclean over that holiday, it didn't matter that you were clean 7 days later. And so the practice, we want to know, what is this whitewash tombs? The practice was to whitewash the outside of the tomb so that people would know that this was a tomb a tomb where dead men's bones were. This cave had dead men's bones in there. Don't go in there, right? Now, what is whitewashing? Whitewashing is just they would use like gypsum or a light colored mud or something to make a paste or a covering of some kind, almost a paint that would go on the outside of the tomb. And the reason that we call it whitewash, people say, oh, he just whitewashed that, is it's different from actual paint that has some kind of permanence. The whitewash would disappear as soon as it rained. And so the idea when he says that you are whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones is the whitewashing is temporary. You look good now, but what's inside of you and what's coming out of your mouth is uncleanness. And that's what Jesus is saying when he says that you're whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones. Now back to verse 13 here in our chapter. Their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they have practiced deceit. And so Paul is expanding on this. This is, again, quoting another psalm. In this case, it's Psalm 5, verse 9. And Paul's going through and saying, your throat is out an open tomb. It's full of dead men's bones. You're unclean when you speak. Out of the heart, out of the abundance of the heart, man speaks, right? So next verse, the poison of asps, are actually the next part of 13. The poison of asps is under their lips. This is Psalm 143. And the poison of asps, this is like a cobra or a really venomous snake that the venom would kill you quickly. And the poison of asps under their lips, what he's saying is that these are deadly things that people say. Verse 14, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Psalm 10:7, again, cursing and bitterness. These are dead, unclean things that are coming out of people. They say evil, destructive things, and not only do they say evil things, they do evil things. Verse 15, their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery in their ways are in their ways, and the way of peace they've not known. There's no fear of God before their eyes. This is Isaiah 59:7. And again, what he's saying here is every man is guilty before God. There's not a single man anywhere who dares to stand before God in his own righteousness. And what Paul's delivering here is, again, it doesn't matter at all what your lineage is. It doesn't matter whether you're Jewish, whether you're an Israelite of Israelites, or he said a Hebrew of Hebrews, or whether you're a Gentile. This is the condition of man, independent of who you are, independent of your background. And verse 19, he says, now that we know that whatever the law says, let me see if I can get this up on the screen here. Whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped and all the world may become guilty before God. And so what Paul's saying is, we know that whatever the law says to those who are under the law. Who are those who are under the law? Were the Gentiles under the law? Were the Greeks under the law? Was the law something that was given to everyone, or was it given to the Jews? And so Paul's indicating here that the law, those under the law, are guilty before God. And it was an assumption that was already made that the Gentiles were guilty before God. This was like not even a question. The Gentiles, of course, they're guilty. They don't even have the oracles of God. They're not even circumcised. These guys, of course, they're guilty. And what Paul's explaining here is that the law and the inability of the Jews to keep it was a demonstration that they were no better, which is why he says at the end of the verse here, and all the world may become guilty before God. So Paul's demonstrating here no advantage to the Jew over the Greek at all. Okay. Verse 20, therefore by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. And so when he says by the deeds of the law, what does he mean? He's saying if you keep the law, if you keep the ritual festivals, if you keep kosher in what you eat, if you do everything right according to the law, it's just not going to matter. The end of the verse is, and all the world may become guilty before God, right? In verse 19, by the deeds of the law, by following the code, no flesh will be justified. And so justified means, and I've heard it said this way, and you probably have too, just as if I'd never sinned. And you will not be justified, he says, by the deeds of the law. There's nothing you can do to keep the rituals. You can't do it no matter what. The law was intended to show us our sin, not to justify us from our sin. Now, I'm going to give you verse 21 here, and I'll tell you why I'm going to stop here, and we'll continue this next week with the second half of chapter 3 here. Verse 21 says, but now the righteousness of God, apart from the law, is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ and on all who believe. And so he now is saying he's given the indictment. Chapter 1, indictment of the Greeks. Chapter 2, indictment of the Jews. The first half of chapter 3 here is demonstrating that there's no difference between the two. And now, starting in verse 21, he goes on and starts explaining the solution, the way that people become justified, how it works, and how you get saved. And so that's where we'll pick up on the next episode, and probably the last half of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4, because it really is kind of a complete thought between the two. So quick reminder, if you want to comment, have questions, disagreements, call the message line, 866-988-8311. Send an email, brian@thefootlight.com. Comments, questions on Facebook, YouTube, other platforms are welcome. And if you want to support the show, if you're on Facebook, there's a thing called stars. If you can go to the website, you'll figure out how to do it. None of the money comes in, and it's not very much. Even if it was a lot, it would never go to me. It would always go into infrastructure and promoting the show or additional platforms to put it on, etc. So thanks again for your time and attention. I hope that you found this valuable, and God bless you guys. And Lord willing, I will see you next Sunday morning, 6 a.m. Pacific as normal, and we'll go from there. So thanks again, and Lord bless you today and all that you do, and be glorified, Lord, in everything. And if there's anything I taught here that's wrong, just erase it from people's minds, Lord, and let your word be powerful and my words be in the background. Thanks again. This is the Footlight Broadcasting. My name is Brian O'Keller. See you next week.
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. That should brighten your day a little. Actually, a lot. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
David's Bridal, where brides and bridesmaids get fabulously dressed. We let our friends pick out what we wear, show off our dance moves, obsess over every little detail, hold your hand through it all, smile bravely when it's time to let go. Make your dreams come true. The things we do for love. Only at David's Bridal.